something to do with Flaco the owl. And every angle I went about it was too serious, so I stumbled into it from a different angle, which was kind of a hard-boiled mystery. So, this is called Dark and Stormy and Martini. I've always been drawn to birds, stories of them, sightings of them. I've also always resisted admitting this out loud. So predictable to relate to the thing that flies, but I can't deny it. Many of my earliest memories revolve around a deep love for winged creatures. The childhood tantrum when the wasp exterminator was called, the farm chicken who I loved, and the farmer boy who told me what was to become of her. Later in life, my cliched love became difficult to conceal. My first two boyfriends were animal geeks and could tell me the names of all the birds in the forests which chaperoned our adolescent dates. I was attracted to these boys' knowledge and respect for the birds, and perhaps I thought it would translate to a knowledge and respect for me. It did not. Over time, the force of my latent bisexuality won out over default heteronormativity, and I began to date exclusively women. All of this, in a roundabout way, is how I found myself to be perched on a stool at Bimmelman's bar, halfway through a dark and stormy, and feeling anxious to get on with my night. My date had not yet arrived, and the leather booths were filling up. A martini glass reserved the seat to my left, and it was getting more tempting by the minute. I was just about to sample it when Detective Nenea blew in, plumped down, and gulped the drink herself. "That's sweet," she said. "You remembered." Everything about her appearance was sleek, and everything about her energy was frazzled. I was not surprised. This very contradiction was what drew me to her in the first place. Her Hinge photos were all clean girl aesthetic, pristine and effortlessly posed. Her smooth skin was peppered with classy little tattoos. Even in life, she appeared to be in portrait mode. The bar seemed blurred behind her, her hair gently rippling in the dim light. But her bios were riddled with typos and sentence fragments, as though someone had snatched her phone before she was done writing. "I know the best spot in town for Martini. 2 truths and a lie. I'm private detective and never drove car. I don't like lying," she'd explained during our texting courtship. The sole complete answer on her profile was this: "What if I told you that I know what happened to Flaco?" A Flaco mention is an automatic swipe right for me. The majestic owl who escaped the Central Park Zoo some years ago and learned to be wild, of course I loved him. In his amber eyes I saw victory against all odds, proof that the forces which fence us in can be transcended. When he died, I mourned for days, leaving my apartment only to fetch food for my calico, whose meowing eventually lulled me back to the rhythms of life, the slog, the daily slog. I, too, knew what had happened to Flaco, a systemic failure to thoroughly account for the ecological consequences of rat-culling initiatives. Beware the tyrants who condemn rats, they may come for you next. In pursuing Detective Nenea, I hoped to find a twin flame with whom to process the tragedy. But when I brought it up, she balked. I had already performed the standard inquisition: jobs, families, coming out stories, coming to New York stories, easy jokes, casting of foils at the bar to make fun of when her own conversation threatened to stall. I didn't want to bring up the bird too early because my tendency to soapbox turns people away. But an hour in and drunk on my tab, I figured I'd earned it. I crunched an almond all casual-like and asked, "So, you know what happened to Flaco?" "I thought I took that off my profile," she said, her eyes flitting about as though for an escape. I was surprised, but recovered quickly. It was immediately clear that a little Hinge line went beyond a conversation starter. She knew something I didn't. I played dumb. "Oh, I change my answers all the time, too. Such an inspiring story, though." She relaxed, and I allowed her the illusion of control. She relayed an unrelated saga about renting a summer house with an ex-girlfriend, only to discover that her ex's ex was staying in another house across the lake, which explained the ex's kayak flights in the middle of the night. The story smacked of canned narrative, over-rehearsed on who knows how many dates. All the same, I laughed at the funny parts and feigned shock at the inevitable conclusion, a bitter fight and an attempted drowning. I was bored and restless for some real tea. She was sipping a fresh martini. By this point, I'd switched to almonds and water. When finally our foils evacuated a nearby leather booth, we slid in. Our thighs were touching, and soon enough she made a move. I kept our macking at a level appropriate for the upscale setting. She wanted more, which meant she wanted something from me. With these improved odds, I tried again. "So, detective," I flirted, "what do you know about the bird?" Her hand was on my thigh, and I felt her fingers clench. Long nails darted against my skin. "Ow," I said, to buy myself some points. "Sorry," she said, then sighed. "Why do you keep asking?" I gave her an abridged version of my soapbox, heavy on the passion. The old kit and caboodle about breeding animals in captivity, my sojourn on a winter's day to see Flacco at the Harlem Reservoir, where I watched him sparrow dive after some invisible prey, my simultaneous awe and anger at the concrete massacre of our natural world. I felt my cheeks flush and I realized I was no longer hamming it up. I really did feel this way. I crunched an almond and focused on absorbing the baby tears back into my eyeballs. Detective Linnea sized me up, not without desire, and seemed to make a call. I was on the case, she began. What case? I asked. The breakout, she said with a tone of mild regret. Somebody, I'm sure you know this, snipped the wires of Flacco's enclosure on the evening of February 2nd, 2023. Groundhog's Day, I said unhelpfully. She nodded and continued. The police were no use, of course, just fiddling on their phones near the yellow tape. So the WCS, that's the Wildlife Conservation Society, called me. Well, I called them and they called me back. I've worked a number of animal-related cases, mostly lost cats, troubled dogs, escaped pythons, that sort of thing. So I was happy to offer my services. The WCS's efforts were focused on recapturing the bird, so they just handed me a file and said good luck. It was pretty slim, mostly just employee timesheets and cage dimensions, not nearly big enough, by the way. I grunted in sympathy. But there was a footnote about a spate of other zoo breakouts. The papers didn't run this, but it was an epidemic at the time. Terrapins missing from a Texas zoo, 12 squirrel monkeys kidnapped in Louisiana. You've heard of copycat killers. Well, this was copycat vigilantism. See, I made a timeline and found a pretty clear domino effect, all beginning with a little red panda at the San Diego Zoo who actually freed herself by climbing to the top of her enclosure and swinging to an outside tree. Now, Adira, that's her name, she is what we call a flagship species, an animal with enough charisma to act as an ambassador for an entire ecosystem. Think pandas, condors, Mudang, Coco, the octopus from my octopus teacher. As Detective Linnea rattled off other beloved representatives of fauna kind, the figures behind her seemed to quiver and dance. Spring surrounded us in the form of Ludwig Bemelman's Madeline in Central Park, a hand-painted mural with a wall for each season. Just above Linnea's lovely exposed shoulder, 3 bunnies dined in a gestural field, an entire meadow conjured with a wash of chartreuse. I could imagine a tiny owl fitting into the scene, and in that instant I felt a stab of sadness. But why? I cried, more so in mourning than anything. Exactly, motive, said Detective Linnea. What you have to understand is, critter nappers span a wide range of profiles. You've got your dark web poachers, your standard PETA protesters. I've learned to follow the species. Rookies go for the monkeys, aspiring smugglers like the big cats, but the birds. Detective Linnea quieted here. With a somber air, she wiped the condensation from her martini glass. Speaking slowly, she continued. To see how things are, and to know how things could be. This, and I'm speculating here, is what compels a birdwatcher to act against the law. Whoever freed Flacco had the same MO as the Houston Pelican bandit, a hole cut in a steel metal fence with some sort of crude knife, judging by the saw patterns. Now, there was no evidence of baiting. Whoever did it simply cut the hole and left Flacco to his own devices. Is it true he did it during mating season, I interjected, that his natural instincts compelled him to fly out in search of love into the streets of poisoned rats? I knew it was true, had in fact ranted about it myself on many a date, but I wanted to signal to Detective Linnea that I shared her sympathies for the avian perpetrator. Linnea examined me and seemed to find something she wanted more than another martini. She proposed a change of scenery. Your place, maybe? It was decided. She was hot to trot, and I was hooked on the story. I paid the check, and soon enough we were stumbling the 10-block walk to the F train. I lived right by the Gowanus Canal, an ecological disaster site buttressed by a thick layer of toxic sludge known as black mayonnaise. Oil, grease, mercury, and all manner of diseases. I explained as much to Detective Linnea, who expressed a righteous anger on behalf of all aquatic life. Her passion excited me, and for the first time that night, I wanted more than answers. But I still wanted those answers. I fully feel you on the freedom front, but what about lifespan, I baited. Captive animals live 2, maybe 3 times longer than their wild counterparts. She gave me a withering look. But what kind of life? Anyway, let's leave it there. Tell me about you. Do you have cousins? The cool night air had revived Detective Linnea's sense of judgment. She clammed up, hemming and hawing about privileged information. I needed her back on my side, and fast. I glanced at the train stop's LED screen and confirmed we had 6 easy minutes to dawdle. Let's not go down just yet, I growled, spinning her against the staircase railing. Her sacrum pressed against the rail, her long mane dangled in the void to the underground. I kissed her neck with an animal force, holding her just as a hawk grips its prey. She resisted, then relented, and I noticed a small tattoo on the back of her forearm, binoculars. A blacked out moment later, we were side by side on the F train's gold and salmon seats. Both of us were riled up, neither satisfied. I pushed again, going so far as to ask who done it, though I had a pretty good hunch. I tried with an earnest gaze to communicate that I was a dead body type of girl, a candidate for co-conspiracy, but she demurred at every angle. In a not-so-subtle display of self-protection, she whipped out a nail file to whittle her French tips. I wasn't quite sure how the daggers she was shaping would work in the bedroom, but I didn't have to wonder long. At East Broadway, just before we went underwater, she darted through the closing doors, out of my sight and into the night. I never saw her again. For all my admiration of birds, I don't like getting too close to them. When I look into their beady eyes, and I'm sorry to say this, there's just not a lot going on. But Flacco's eyes were sunset all over Eurasia. For 12 years, he'd lived alone under a painted sky between a clock tower and a penguin enclosure. In the wild, his kind lives in woodlands, sea cliffs, deserts, and alpine meadows. And though he'd never seen the natural sky, he knew he belonged there. A portal appeared, and the choice was his, stasis or freedom. He acted on animal instinct.